When West Germany rebuilt its armed forces after the Second World War, it made a deliberate and genuinely unusual choice. For decades, its soldiers wore plain, uncamouflaged uniforms, a decision rooted less in military logic than in a nation still deeply uncomfortable with anything resembling its wartime past. This video documents every major uniform the German armed forces have issued from the founding of the Bundeswehr in 1955 to today. And one camouflage pattern on this list took over 3 decades to actually arrive, arguably decades later than almost any other major Western military. That pattern is coming later in this video. We start with the earliest years of the newly formed Bundeswehr, Feldanzug, 1956, the very first standard uniform of the newly established West German Bundeswehr. This simple olive-gray woolen field uniform deliberately avoided any resemblance to wartime German military clothing, prioritizing a clean, modern break from the past over any tactical camouflage consideration. Dienstanzug service uniform, the standard everyday and formal service dress worn for garrison duties and official functions. A conservative dark uniform reflecting the young Bundeswehr's cautious, understated institutional image during its earliest and most politically sensitive years. Grenztruppen border guard clothing, specialized cold weather clothing issued to units patrolling the tense, heavily fortified inner German border, reflecting the genuinely unique demands of standing watch along one of the Cold War's most dangerous frontiers, moving into the main decades of the Cold War, when uniform philosophy barely changed at all. Kampfanzug field uniform, the Bundeswehr's standard plain olive combat uniform throughout most of the Cold War, remarkably free of any camouflage pattern whatsoever at a time when NATO allies in Warsaw, packed adversaries alike, were increasingly adopting disruptive patterns. A striking outlier that puzzled foreign military observers for decades. Anorak and cold weather overgarments, heavy insulated outer layers issued for winter exercises along the North German plain and mountainous training areas, essential given the genuinely brutal European winters Bundeswehr units regularly trained through. Parade and ceremonial ensemble, a more formal version of the standard uniform reserved for military parades and official state functions, deliberately restrained in styling to avoid any visual echo of pre-war or wartime German military pageantry. The East German side of the story followed a completely different path. Envious Strichtarn pattern. The East German National People's Army adopted this distinctive rain pattern camouflage decades before West Germany embraced camouflage at all. A striking irony given the ideological gulf between the two German states during this period. MVA Flecktarn pattern, an alternative East German camouflage design used across various NVA units, reflecting the Warsaw Pact's generally earlier and more consistent embrace of disruptive patterns compared to their West German counterparts across the border. Then, finally, decades later than almost any comparable military, came genuine camouflage, Flecktarn. This is the pattern referenced at the beginning of this video. Introduced in 1990 as German reunification fundamentally reshaped the entire armed forces, this distinctive 5-color spot pattern finally replaced the plain olive uniforms that had defined West German soldiers for well over 3 decades. A change so overdue that some military historians consider it one of the slowest camouflage adoptions of any major post-war military power. Kampfanzug 90, the broader uniform system built around the new Flecktarn pattern, incorporating updated cut and material alongside the long-awaited camouflage print itself, moving into the post-reunification and expeditionary era, as German forces began deploying abroad for the first time since the Second World War. Westentarnanzug desert pattern, developed specifically for deployments to Afghanistan and earlier Balkan operations. This sand-toned adaptation of the Flecktarn concept gave troops appropriate camouflage for arid environments, entirely unlike anything encountered on the North German plain. Troppentarn, a lighter-weight tropical variant designed for hot, humid deployment environments, prioritizing breathability alongside adequate camouflage performance. Bundeswehr UN peacekeeping uniform variants. Standard uniforms modified with UN insignia and blue berets for German participation in international peacekeeping missions, reflecting the country's gradually expanding role in multinational operations decades after its founding. The most recent generation brought a fundamental rethink, built around actual combat feedback from Afghanistan. Multitarn, introduced around 2015 as a genuine multi-environment successor to Flecktarn. This pattern was developed partly in response to lessons learned during sustained combat operations, designed to perform reasonably well across a broader range of terrain than the original Flecktarn pattern had ever been tested against. Infanterist der Zukunft modular equipment system. Far more than a simple uniform, this comprehensive modernization program bundled body armor, load-bearing vests, communications equipment, and protective clothing into a single integrated system, reflecting a broader NATO-wide shift toward treating soldier equipment as one unified platform rather than separate individual items. A handful of additional and specialized uniforms round out the picture of nearly 70 years of German military clothing evolution. Marine uniform naval service dress, the German Navy's distinctive dark blue uniform, maintaining continuity with older naval traditions, even as Army uniforms underwent repeated camouflage revisions across the decades. Flieger combination flight suit, standard flight suits worn by Luftwaffe aircrew, functionally similar to flight suits used across NATO air forces, but carrying distinct German rank and unit insignia. Gebirgsjäger mountain uniform, specialized cold weather and mountaineering clothing issued to Germany's dedicated mountain infantry units, reflecting genuinely different equipment demands from standard infantry serving on flatter terrain. KSK Special Forces uniform variants. Germany's Kommando Spezialkraft Special Operations Unit adopted specialized combat clothing and equipment well ahead of standard infantry, mirroring the broader patterns seen across other nations where elite units field test new equipment years before wider adoption. Modern flame-resistant combat uniform, a contemporary fabric treatment reducing burn injury risk from improvised explosive devices, adopted following operational lessons from Afghanistan deployments. Bundeswehr physical training uniform, standardized athletic wear for fitness training, evolving over the decades, from simple cotton shorts and shirts into modern, moisture-wicking synthetic fabrics. There's an entire additional layer of uniform history that rarely gets covered outside dedicated collector and historian circles, but that filled genuinely distinct roles across the decades. Felgier military police uniform, standard field uniforms modified with distinctive gorget insignia and equipment specific to Germany's military police units, maintaining clear visual identification during joint operations and garrison duties alike. MBC protective suit, specialized nuclear, biological, and chemical protective clothing developed throughout the Cold War, given the very real possibility of operating in a contaminated environment along the inner German border, an ever-present concern that shaped equipment design decisions most other NATO members took somewhat less seriously. Winter Tarnanzug over whites. Reversible white snow camouflage overgarments worn over standard uniforms during winter exercises, allowing rapid concealment adaptation without requiring an entirely separate cold weather uniform system. Bundeswehr reservist training uniform, a slightly simplified uniform variant issued to reservist forces during periodic training exercises. Functionally similar to active duty gear but reflecting the somewhat different logistics and issue priorities of part-time service members. Early Cold War steel helmet cover patterns. Though not full uniforms, distinctive helmet cover treatments evolved alongside broader uniform changes, and their gradual shift from plain olive to eventual Flecktarn patterning mirrored the same slow, deliberate pace seen across the rest of Bundeswehr equipment. UNFI and KFO are deployment variants. Uniform modifications specific to German participation in Lebanon and Kosovo peacekeeping missions, incorporating mission-specific insignia and occasionally region-appropriate camouflage adjustments. Beyond the standard Flecktarn and Multitarn patterns, from the deliberately plain olive uniforms of a nation still working through the weight of its own history, to a camouflage pattern that arrived decades later than almost anywhere else in NATO. German military uniform history reflects something genuinely unusual among major armed forces. A country that treated its own uniform choices as a political and historical statement just as much as a tactical one. The eventual adoption of Flecktarn in 1990 wasn't simply a camouflage upgrade. It coincided precisely with reunification and a fundamentally reshaped national identity. A rare example of clothing and history moving in lockstep. Nearly 70 years after the Bundeswehr's founding, the story of its uniforms remains as much about a nation reckoning with its past as it is about protecting soldiers in the field.